the dishonesty that has existed is that we somehow led people to believe that.
Também ninguém fala da intervenção do Sr. Vitoria Nuland.
Bem, quando falamos na relação com os aliados, podemos começar pelos aliados europeus. E do ponto de vista militar, de facto, há uma grande confusão gerada. E isso prende-se fundamentalmente com a relação com os aliados da NATO. E há aqui uma situação extremamente incómoda, na medida em que os aliados da NATO, do meu ponto de vista, estão a reagir em demasia. Ou seja, os Estados Unidos até ao momento não disseram que iriam retirar o apoio o apoio do ponto de vista da proteção nuclear à NATO, e o que nós vimos foi uma iniciativa por parte do chanceler ou do futuro chanceler Mearsheimer a dizer que, bom, nós agora já não estamos interessados no chapéu de chuva nuclear fornecido pelos Estados Unidos e vamos avançar com uma alternativa com base nas capacidades do Reino Unido e da França, o que me parece algo absolutamente impraticável. E por outro lado, também até à data ainda não tivemos nenhuma postura por parte dos Estados Unidos a dizer nós não nos vamos comprometer com o artigo 5º. Portanto, do meu ponto de vista, do lado europeu e neste particular, estamos a ser confrontados com um excesso de reação da parte europeia. E isso coloca-se também relativamente a estas questões do rearmamento e, nomeadamente, à possibilidade da Europa, ou pelo menos alguns Estados europeus, avançarem com uma operação militar na Ucrânia. Eu recordo que há mecanismos na NATO que permitem o envolvimento dos europeus sem terem a participação dos americanos. Isso chama-se Berlin Plus e parece que está toda a gente esquecida disso. Até à data, os Estados Unidos não retiraram o apoio, ou continuam a fornecer armamento, veremos como será no futuro, mas para já não, mas continuam a fornecer informação estratégica e a utilização do Starlink. Nós sabemos que os Estados Unidos estão particularmente interessados e empenhados em celebrar um acordo das terras raras e dos minerais críticos. Isto já foi formulado de várias maneiras, mas de qualquer forma a Ucrânia tem resistido a isso. Veremos qual vai ser o desfecho, até porque existem fortes indícios que a Ucrânia já se teria comprometido com a Inglaterra e, para além disso, há uma série de outros compromissos assumidos anteriormente. Por exemplo, há uma empresa australiana que já tinha celebrado contratos no domínio da exploração do lítio. Portanto, isto é uma saga que vai continuar. Há uma grande resistência do lado ucraniano, nomeadamente do Parlamento. O Parlamento quer saber exatamente quais são as cedências que Zelensky irá fazer. Portanto, estamos aqui numa embrulhada. O que é um facto é que, até à data, Zelensky não assinou papel nenhum. Vamos estar muito atentos e ver até quando ele vai conseguir resistir. Mas mais tarde ou mais cedo vai ter que ceder. Agora, a questão da Groenlândia parece uma situação extremamente interessante de ser analisada. Independentemente das questões do direito internacional e todas essas envolventes, estamos a falar de um aliado. E Trump faz isso porque tem os seus objetivos a atingir e as suas promessas eleitorais. Há o argumento securitário, mas eu penso que o argumento securitário, neste caso particular, não é convincente. O que Trump está efetivamente interessado é nas riquezas minerais da Groenlândia, no seu subsolo, porque do ponto de vista securitário poderia garantir essa questão. Aliás, já está de certa forma garantida, mas através de acordos, e isso não precisava de ir ao ponto que está a querer e agora, nomeadamente, já não falamos na ocupação da Groenlândia, mas na posse da Groenlândia. Agora, há aqui uma questão que me parece que deve ser analisada, é com alguma estranheza que eu vejo a ausência de resposta por parte da União Europeia. Onde é que está a senhora van der Leyen? Onde é que está a senhora Callas? Onde é que está o senhor Costa? Quer dizer, tudo isto está a acontecer e não há uma oposição determinada relativamente a esta matéria. Eu, aliás, até tenho alguma curiosidade em saber se amanhã e depois de amanhã, nas reuniões ministeriais que vão ocorrer em Bruxelas, para além das questões dos contributos, e do aumento da percentagem do orçamento do Estado que terá que ser dedicado à defesa, se este tema também vai ser discutido e também estará na agenda. Parece-me incontornável, mas isto digo eu, que este tema não seja varrido para baixo do tapete, porque isto parece-me absolutamente inaceitável. Bom, nós sabemos que Trump fez uma série de promessas e que, nesta altura, está com muita dificuldade em cumprir e, em alguns casos, nem a está a cumprir. Eu falo, por exemplo, do Médio Oriente, as expectativas que existiam relativamente ao Médio Oriente, de paz, e o que se está a verificar é algo completamente diferente, nomeadamente quando falamos do Irão e destas ameaças de ataque ao Irão. A mesma questão se pode debater relativamente à China. Mas, ainda voltando ao processo de paz na Ucrânia, e isso penso que é o que mais nos está a concentrar as atenções, sim, é que a sua análise, a sua visão do problema era extremamente simplista. Isto é um tema extremamente complexo que não se vai resolver de um dia para o outro e estas propostas de solucionar em 24 horas ou definir uma data como 30 de Abril, eu penso que isso é absolutamente desajustado, não faz sentido e não é assim que este tema tem que ser abordado. Portanto, a complexidade é imensa, as cedências terão que ser imensas e o que nós verificamos hoje, e não há, no curto prazo, não se vislumbra a possibilidade de haver uma alteração, é o facto de as partes manterem os seus objetivos maximalistas. E, portanto, o que se poderá discutir agora é perceber até que ponto Trump poderá atuar no sentido de fazer com que os diferentes atores reformulem os seus objetivos estratégicos maximalistas que nesta altura defendem. E isso, há aqui um aspecto que me parece importante sublinhar, é que Trump tem instrumentos para o fazer e ainda não os colocou em cima da mesa. E todos nós sabemos que esses instrumentos passam por uma ação de diplomacia coerciva que, a meu ver, ainda não está nos termos que poderia estar, se de facto quiser provocar uma alteração dos objetivos estratégicos das partes.
Broad stroke, listen, you know the details, and these details are, and I'm not taking a side on this, but if there was any, which a lot of people aren't really advocates of, but Trump, if anything, kind of, and whether he was a puppet or not, whatever you believe, he kind of normalized the Russian relationship, kind of, right, by becoming somewhat of a friend of Putin's. So between that time and the time that Putin, there was no NATO movement between the time after the Trump administration.
Yeah, well, what we did is then we overthrew the government of Ukraine.
So no, he came into Ukraine before.
We overthrew the government in 2014. USAID, which has spent $5 billion, which is a front for the CIA, which everybody acknowledges, went in there and started a revolution called the Maidan Rebellion, where there was these protests and ended with the overthrow of the elected government of Ukraine that wanted to keep Ukraine neutral. Yanukovych wanted to keep NATO neutral. We wanted a pro-U.S. government. So we went in there in 2014, overthrew their government, and placed a government. And by the way, a month before the overthrow, we now have tapes. You can go on the internet and listen to Vitoria Nuland, who's the head of the neocons now, the deputy director of the State Department, choosing the new Ukrainian cabinet that will be put in place after the coup that was still a month away. So she knew the coup was coming a month in advance.
But who is she to us?
She's us. She's the head of the State Department. She's now, number 3 in the State Department. but she's been in the State Department. She's one of the, she runs the neocon program, which is, continual wars. So we then pick a new government. The new government comes in, immediately begins attacking the people of Donbass and Lugansk, who are Russian-speaking ethnic Russians. They banned the Russian language, there was two languages, there were two official languages. Ukraine, they banned that. Violence immediately erupts, and they kill 14. There's a civil war. This war started in 2014. There's 14,000 ethnic Russians are killed. And Putin kept saying, you're killing our people.
This is Vitoria Nuland. She has been serving as the Undersecretary for Political Affairs in the Biden administration and has decided to retire. She is often, depending on where people stand, criticized or admired for her extremely hawkish line on Russia. Her support for Ukraine was a driving force in USA's Ukraine war strategy. She has been a staunch advocate for the billions and billions in weapons aid to Ukraine during this war. Let's just say, without her, the wedge between Ukraine and Russia would not have deepened as much as it has today. According to the White House, her efforts have been indispensable to confronting Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, marshalling a global coalition to ensure his strategic failure. For Russia, Nuland's departure is great news. They see it as a reflection of the Biden administration's failure of anti-Russia strategy. Vitoria Nuland is currently the third highest ranking diplomat in the US State Department, but she is hardly a diplomat in practice. As one European official once said about her, she doesn't engage like most diplomats. She comes off as rather ideological. You see, Nuland was Vice President Dick Cheney's advisor during the country's invasion of Iraq in 2003. She was a prominent player under Hillary Clinton and John Kerry when they were Secretaries of State. She's one of the most prominent neoconservative and anti-Russia voices in American power circles. Democracy and diplomacy are just mere words in her world of covert interference and color revolutions. Nuland is infamous for being involved in the 2014 Euromaidan uprising in Ukraine, which ultimately led to a coup against President Yanukovych, who was elected in 2010. And she's even more infamous for a particular phone call. While serving in the Obama administration, she had a phone call with the US ambassador to Ukraine, and this call was leaked. What was heard in this leak was shocking. It was Nuland casually calling the shots on who joins the new Ukrainian government, even deciding who becomes prime minister. Not only this, but at one point, Nuland would say,
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it and, the EU.
She had supposedly said this about the European Union in exasperation with its soft stance on the anti-government protests in Ukraine at the time. So what happened here? You see, this call, quite obviously intercepted by Russia, did two things. It showed just how much disdain and disregard American foreign policy neocons have for Europe, and how deeply the US was involved in controlling the formation of the Ukrainian government after claiming in public that it believed that those decisions were for the people of Ukraine to make. This unmasked Washington's two-faced foreign policy approach, in the case of Ukraine, preaching democracy on the outside and murdering it behind closed doors. Vitoria Nuland represents American foreign policy's most covert traits. An interventionist to the core, Nuland was always a step ahead to call for the most hawkish stance against Russia. Now let's wind back to 2013. The then Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych had been so far seen as a friendly leader by the West. All went well until 2013, when he broke the pattern and declined a political association and free trade agreement deal with the European Union. He had meant to balance ties with Ukraine's eastern neighbor, Russia, with this move. But more than the EU, it was the US which took great offense from this rejection, and thus began massive protests in Ukraine called Euromaidan. These protests were highly divisive in nature, vehemently pro-EU and anti-Russia. A bunch of US officials, including the State Department's very own number 2, Vitoria Nuland, was seen handing food and cookies to the protesters. But as is customary for color revolutions, the peaceful protests soon broke out into brutal clashes which caused over 100 deaths. All this lasted for weeks in Kiev until one day Yanukovych's regime had been toppled. This episode stirred a lot of bad blood between Ukraine and Russia. It is said that President Obama was reluctant to confront Russia over Ukraine, but Hillary Clinton and Vitoria Nuland coaxed their way through. Now, Putin was triggered. On February 22, 2014, 5 days after Viktor Yanukovych was removed from power, Putin launched the invasion of Crimea. Unlike anything we see today, this takeover was bloodless, and Russia was actually accepted among the people in Crimea. In Donbass, Russia stepped up its support for pro-Russia insurgents fighting for independence from Ukraine. On this front, the fight with Ukrainian forces had been ongoing for almost 8 years when in 2022, Putin launched an all-out invasion into Ukraine. So, you see, Vitoria Nuland's school of thought triggered a domino effect beyond her pay grade at the time. But she was not done. Nuland has harbored ambitions to take the top job in the US State Department. She's been serving in the government for 3 decades, with only the Trump years being an exception. Now, under Biden, her ambitions peaked. She lost an internal power struggle. Nuland, once in line for the Deputy Secretary of State position, lost out to Kurt Campbell, who took office last month. Perhaps she saw this as the end of the road for her career.
Food for thought. US Assistant Secretary of State Vitoria Nuland in Independence Square in Kiev handing out parcels to anti-government protesters and security forces. Was it diplomacy from the woman credited with using a graphic swear word when referring to the EU in a phone call which was allegedly hacked and ended up on YouTube? Her language was more tempered when she met the press.
Obviously not going to comment on private diplomatic conversations, other than to say it was pretty impressive tradecraft. The audio was extremely clear.
I don't think Cleach should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
In terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tony Boak and his guys. And, you know, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, you know, what he needs is Cleach and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week, you know. I just think Cleach going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
Nuland said she believed her reported comments, including apparently saying Vitaly Klitschko should not serve in any future cabinet, will not damage relations with the opposition. The phone call has overshadowed Nuland's visit to Kiev. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has said the comments were totally unacceptable.
Some NATO members said they too would like the Ukraine to join NATO. We directly encouraged the uprising in the Ukraine that led to the toppling of the President Yanukovych.
What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures. And we are all mortal.
So, was it unprovoked?
Well, we did hear that a lot of times. I actually asked a research assistant of mine to count how many times we heard that in the New York Times in that first year from February 2022 to February 2023 in their opinion columns. It was 26 times unprovoked. Of course, things aren't unprovoked.
It's
that
almost
way.
A brand name, the unprovoked invasion.
It's the lazy person's dodge for actually trying to think through what's going on.
Yes.
And it's very dangerous because it's wrong. It gets the whole story completely wrong. And it misunderstands the trap that we set for ourselves as the United States to push Ukraine deeper and deeper and deeper into this hopeless mess that they're in right now.
Is there is no evidence, let me emphasize, zero evidence to support that argument.
Which part? That he would, the imperialist part, the sense that he sought to conquer all of Ukraine and move on and conquer.
There's no evidence he was interested in conquering all of Ukraine. There's no evidence beforehand that he was interested in conquering any of Ukraine.
I'm going to issue a challenge to Mike McCall and Mike Johnson and everyone. If you have proof that Vladimir Putin is going to march across Europe, going to go all the way to Kiev, take Poland next, and then keep on going, unclassify it. Declassify that proof and show it to the American people. Prove to the American people why they need to send their hard-earned money over there. Prove it. I dare you to prove it, because you do not have the proof. And they're not capable of showing it, Steve. This is the biggest, most repulsive scam, and it's been happening for decades, and it's all they claim to protect American jobs and to keep the military-industrial base going and employed, and it's all for our economy. This is not an economy anybody wants. We don't want an economy built on people's blood and dead bodies in foreign countries. We want an America first economy, and from now on, Steve, we are going to demand it from our Republican leaders. I don't care if the Speaker's office becomes a revolving door. If that's exactly what needs to happen, then let it be. But the days are over of the old Republican Party that wants to fund foreign wars and murder people in foreign lands while they stab the American people in their face and refuse to protect Americans and fix our problems over here.
And there's no way that an army that had 190,000 troops at the most, right, could have conquered all of Ukraine. Just impossible. As I like to emphasize, when the Germans went into Poland in 1939, and the Germans, you want to remember, were only intent on conquering the western half of Poland because the Soviets, who came in later that month, were going to conquer the eastern half of Poland. So the western half of Poland is much smaller than Ukraine. And the Germans went in with 1.5 million troops. If Vladimir Putin were bent on conquering all of Ukraine, he would have needed at least 2 million troops. I would argue he'd need 3 million troops, because not only do you need to conquer the country, you then have to occupy it. But the idea that 190,000 troops was sufficient for conquering all of Ukraine is not a serious argument. Furthermore, he was not interested in conquering Ukraine, and that's why in March 2022, this is immediately after the war starts, he is negotiating with Zelensky to end the war. There are serious negotiations taking place in Istanbul involving the Turks, and Naftali Bennett, who was the Israeli prime minister at the time, was deeply involved in negotiating with both Putin and Zelensky to end the war. Well, if he was interested, Putin, in conquering all of Ukraine, why in God's name would he be negotiating with Zelensky to end the war? And of course, what they were negotiating about was NATO expansion into Ukraine, which was the principal cause of the war. People in the West don't want to hear that argument, because if it is true, which it is, then the West is principally responsible for this bloodbath that's now taking place. And of course, the West doesn't want to be principally responsible. It wants to blame Vladimir Putin. Mm-hmm. So we've invented this story out of whole cloth that he is an aggressor, that he's the second coming of Adolf Hitler, and that what he did in Ukraine was try to conquer all of it. And he failed. But with a little bit of luck, he probably would have conquered all of it. And he'd now be in the Baltic states and eventually end up dominating all of Eastern Europe. As I said, I think there's no evidence to support this.
I think we have heard from Professor Mearsheimer a brilliant analysis of what the situation that we're in, and I agree totally with everything he has described. And I must say that in looking at things today, I cannot be optimistic. And first of all, I think that it has made clear that whatever happens in the future, Ukraine cannot be preserved as you might say, a viable and successful state within those borders that it inherited in 1991. And I say inherited because these borders were set actually literally by communists, and they include areas that had not been traditionally part of Ukraine. And the tragedy of Ukraine, one of them has been that as they were struggling, as all the other ex-Soviet states, to throw off the shackles of communism and all the irrationalities of that, they were confronted with a population that was deeply divided. And they were also subjected to a constitution which did not allow federalism, a federal system which would somehow give more local autonomy to different groups. So that you had a seesaw elections where by slightly more than 50%, the presidency would be won by one side or the other, and then that president would name all the equivalent of the state governors, the provincial leaders. That was a recipe for disaster. And because there was no leader coming forward, that really defined you might say, a new sense of Ukrainian statehood, which would be comfortable both to the Ukrainian speakers and the Russian speakers. So Ukraine's problem was internal. Now, as we have gone forward in our policies, I think that, as Professor Mearsheimer made clear, what we have to consider is not our analysis of the way things are, but what the Russian perception is. After all, people act on their perceptions. And the Russian perception is that we have aggressively attempted to detach both Ukraine and Georgia from any substantial influence by Russia. By the way, if another country had done something similar to one of our neighbors, we would have reacted, I believe, perhaps even more forcefully than President Putin has. So I think we have to bear that in mind. There's almost a hysteria today in condemning Russia as an unprovoked aggressor. Yes, Russia has been an unprovoked aggressor, but they had a precedent. What do you think the U.S. Attack on Iraq was? A country nearly halfway across the world, which did not threaten us and had not threatened us. We had attacked it, invaded it, cheered for our technology that enabled them. No images of how this affected the people on the ground. You know, I'm ashamed to say that the United States has given President Putin every trick in his playbook. Now, that doesn't make it right, what he has done, but we need to. Now, this attempt, in effect, to wage a virtually total war against Russia, I think is deeply and deeply misguided. We face so many threats, mutual threats. We're not over the COVID epidemic yet. This fighting and all of the refugees and so on, this almost certainly is going to make it worse. And we have the whole nuclear threat, which Professor Mearsheimer has described very well. And what about the long-term threats of global warming? How are we going to continue to deal with all these flows of refugees, whether they be economic or whatnot? We are simply undermining the real long-term interests of our countries in getting into this sort of fight. And I'd also say those who think we're simply going to choke Russia and bring it down should understand that this is going to have a serious effect on many other people. In my day, when I was in the Soviet Union had to import close to 30 million tons of grain a year just to survive. This was a tremendous liability, and it's one that we were able to use to pressure them in many ways. Right now, both Ukraine and Russia are net and major grain exporters. It tells you what the new system is like and how different it is from the Soviet Union, by the way. And this affects many countries. You start cutting off that trade. And also the trade not only in energy, but also in precious metals and other things which are essential for much of modern technology. I think that we're going to see, if we continue these policies, and it looks as if we're going to, a real pushback by people who are not willing really to take some of the cost to them for these sanctions, because they are there. And finally, I would say don't underestimate the Russian ability over in a fairly short period of time to overcome some of the technological problems. I also think that the use of the dollar as a weapon, which is what we have been doing, is going in the long run to undermine our dominance of the world financial system. That may take a decade or two, but I think there are very serious implications entirely aside from the nuclear threat, which is very much there. Though I agree with Professor Mearsheimer, it is not probable, but it is possible. And we have to worry about that.
This broke out in 2014, we couldn't blame ourselves. We couldn't blame the West. We couldn't blame NATO expansion. We had to create a new story that made the Russians the bad guys and us the good guys. So all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the Russians became this highly expansionist great power, bent on dominating Eastern Europe, bent on recreating the Russian Empire or the former Soviet Union. But we were not thinking that way before February 2014. Our basic goal was to turn Ukraine into basically a pro-Western liberal democracy, to integrate it into the zone of peace. Of course, it backfired because we didn't listen to the Russians and what their concerns were after the April 2008 Bucharest summit. NATO has never said that Ukraine will not become a member of the alliance. This is a black and white issue. Either you say that or you don't say that. To say that it's not going to happen for a while, it might not ever happen, is not satisfactory to the Russians. The Russians are making it perfectly clear that we have to say that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO. And that has not been said. And you're implying that it has been said. It has not been said. This is a very black and white issue. The second point, we are arming the Ukrainians. We are training the Ukrainians. We have close diplomatic relations with the Ukrainians. We emphasize that we care greatly about their security, even if we won't fight for them. We talk about them in the context of our allies and partners. The rhetoric is used all the time. If you're on the Russian side and you see the Ukrainians being armed, you see the Ukrainians being trained by NATO forces, you see NATO leaders talking about Ukraine as if it were a de facto member of the alliance, you don't think this is going to really upset the Russians? You've been studying great power politics for a long time. You know how great powers behave. They're paranoid about their security. They intensely dislike the idea of another great power with its military alliance marching up to its border. So again, and this is a prescription for disaster. Now you say, maybe this is due to the fact that Joe Biden is weak. This crisis has been on the front burner for a long time. It started in February 2014, and Joe Biden was not the president. Barack Obama was the president, right? The crisis has gone on since then, right, to include the period when Donald Trump was president, and it continues today. And it is going to go on and on as long as we refuse to say some very simple words. Ukraine will not become part of NATO. Idea that Vladimir Putin is the second coming of Adolf Hitler and that Russia today is the second coming of Nazi Germany is simply not a serious argument. Furthermore, nobody is talking about dismembering Ukraine the way Czechoslovakia was dismembered in October 1938 at Munich. That is not what is happening here. What we're talking about is effectively moving away from an effort on the part of the United States and its allies to turn Ukraine into a Western bulwark. And if you're looking for an analogy here, the analogy is the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets tried to put military forces in Cuba. It enraged the United States. And if you look at our relations with Cuba today, we still have sanctions on Cuba. We still have our gun sights on Cuba. Why? Because the thought that those Cubans would invite a distant great power into the Western Hemisphere bothered us so greatly then that it has continued to this day. That's the basic situation that you have in Eastern Europe today. The Russians don't want Ukraine to become a member of NATO in the same way that the United States did not want Cuba to become an ally of the Soviet Union armed with nuclear-tipped missiles from the Soviet Union.
Do you think that there are any parallels, or do you subscribe to the Cuban Missile Crisis analogy?
Oh, I think that's a useful analogy. I think another one could be Austrian neutrality in the Cold War, a way of preserving Austria's sovereignty and independence, not undermining it, not undermining any important international rules, not incorporating a country into a particular military alliance. That is not a violation of any international rules and norms. And I think there's a bit of inflation, rhetorical inflation about the rules when I see members of the Biden administration or other leaders talk about a sacrosanct right of countries to join whatever security arrangements they desire. There is a right to apply, but the right goes only that far. There is no obligation by NATO to admit any other country. It would be absurd if that were to happen. NATO would collapse because a whole slew of countries would seek to join. They would automatically be admitted, and no one would believe that the Article 5 guarantee would be credible. So this is obviously not a way to run international politics.
I think there's no question that from Europe's point of view, it makes sense to have the Americans present in Europe. NATO is a net positive for Europe. The United States serves as a pacifier. There's no question about that. So you have a vested interest in keeping us in Europe. And this, of course, is why I have never once heard a European leader say that the United States should leave Europe or that NATO should disintegrate. Instead, European leaders worry that we will leave Europe and they will be left on their own. So I fully understand that it's in your interest as a European to have the Americans there. The question is whether or not it's in our interest. Now, I think when you look at the domestic political problems that we have at home, it is imperative that we focus much more attention and many more resources on solving our problems at home. Because if we're not careful, we're not going to be a liberal democracy much longer. You do not want to underestimate how much trouble we are in at home. And when you're running all over the world trying to solve everybody else's problems, this is going to detract in good part from fixing problems at home. So that's the first reason I've long been in favor of getting America out of Europe militarily. The second point I would make to you is that we face a peer competitor. You do not want to underestimate the fact that the United States pursued a foolish policy of engagement toward China during the unipolar moment. And in the process, we created a peer competitor. This is one of the greatest strategic blunders of all time. The United States of America helped to create a peer competitor. But that's where we are today. We have a peer competitor in Asia, China. We have no peer competitor in Europe. Therefore, we need to focus laser-like on on East Asia, and we need to pivot out of Europe. The only argument one can make for keeping American forces in Europe, in my opinion, is that we, in effect, work out an arrangement with the Europeans where we continue to serve as the pacifier, and in return, they agree to continue to work with us to contain China.